Well, a very, very warm, well, actually cool in terms of weather, but not in terms of enthusiasm, to all of you for joining us this evening for episode 2 of Elements of Tea, Walking the Path to Harmony, History, Design, and Uses of the Japanese Tea Garden. I'm Liz Hammer, the director of the Hammond Museum and Japanese Stroll Garden, and it is really our honor and pleasure to present this second very terrific program. Now, Michael McKenna is going to welcome all of you on behalf of the Tea Club.
Good evening. My name is Michael McKenna. I'm a student of Omote Senkei Tea and a part of the Hammond Tea Club. The Tea Club is pleased to be presenting a series of programs on the elements of tea. The series began on the 4th Tuesday of last month and will continue until the spring of next year on each 4th Tuesday. Last month's episode gave an overview of the tea ceremony and of this whole program, and each episode will pick up a different facet of tea. Today, we will follow the dewy path that leads right up to the door of the tea room. Then, after each succeeding episode picks up a different facet of the tea ceremony, next spring we'll gather face to face in the Hammond Gardens for an actual cup of tea to be shared together. Welcome to the Tea Club, and back to Liz for the introductions.
Well, thank you, Michael. And just for the format today, as ever, the presentation will be by Lara and Bill Jarvis, and then afterwards there'll be an occasion for some questions as you might have them. Our terrific speakers today have opted to be humble and brief, at least on my part. Bill Jarvis said to simply say that he is a very long time practitioner and enthusiast of the tea ceremony. And Lara Netting is one of our trustees at the Hammond Museum and also is a professor at City College of Modern Japanese and Chinese History, and is also very much engaged with modern collectors of East Asian arts, and also is literally up to our knees and more working on the garden at the Hammond. So without further ado, thank you very much to Lara and Bill for this very welcome program tonight. I'm going to mute myself and then bring up the screen for you both. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a problem just finding the right, if you'd hold on just a second. I don't know, it's just, I have the program up, but I'm just having some trouble getting it on screen. Oh, there it is. Yay. Yay. All right, slides. Okay, I think you two are ready to go, and forgive the brief delay.
Well, thanks very much, Liz. Thank you, Michael. And thanks to all of you who are joining tonight. Just a little housekeeping item for all of you. We're getting some background noise. So if you could just please, everyone who's on this call, put yourselves on mute for now, that would be very welcome. I am Bill Jarvis. I'm a longtime practitioner of tea in the Urasenke tradition, and I'm joined by Lara Netting. We're going to walk through, literally walk through for you, the tea garden. And Liz, if you could kindly advance to the next slide.
Sorry, I'm trying to, it's just not, what is, I think that, sorry, I'm just not used to a Google Doc. That's the bit of the problem. Let me see if anybody has any ideas of how you break it down. Oh, okay.
There we go.
All right. Whatever I did the right thing. I think I noticed what I did. Forgive me.
Very good. There we go. And I just want to take us back to where we were last time. Just a little recap from where we left off. Michael McKenna very competently and clearly described last time that this practice of drinking tea in a powdered form came to Japan along with Zen Buddhism, is brought both by as monks, both as an aid to keeping them awake for their Zen meditation. And also importantly, once it came to Japan, tea drinking became an upper class entertainment, since tea was a rare and expensive thing, treated as a medicine, but also as something that was foreign and interesting. And so Michael described some of these aristocratic teas as competitive, as using luxurious utensils, and as taking place in very importantly, architecturally distinguished surroundings. So Liz, let's move to the next slide, please. So then we find ourselves, after tea has become established in Japan, we then go and zero in on Kyoto and on the nearby city of Sakai, which is just outside of Osaka, an important port city. And in both of these cities, you had lay people, merchants, people who were prosperous and had money, but who were not respected in the traditions of either the Zen monks or the aristocracy that had been the ones who were mainly practicing tea. So these merchants became interested in the idea of taking these Zen ideals of movement through a thoughtful landscape and in preparing and serving the powdered tea, and this idea that you could become enlightened, but you didn't need to be a monk to do it. You could have this done, as it says here, in the context of daily life. So you're turning away now from the aristocratic or the samurai style, which emphasized, as Michael said last time, Chinese style utensils, these very formal rooms, to say, doing something that becomes more rustic, more Japanese. And remember, we're in cities here, but in Japan at that time, very similar to what was happening in the West at that time, you had this ideal of the rural retreat, the merchant who could retreat to the country, not be as formal, be perhaps among friends, but these, instead of being actually in the country, these tea houses, these tea places that were being built were actually in the city. The merchants had their houses behind their shops, which are on the main street, and there were courtyards behind there in which the first tea houses were placed, but nestled in these gardens, these places that simulated this rustic mountain retreat, perhaps of a Buddhist hermit or a Buddhist monk, a little bit of pretend going on here, but with a sincere devotion to finding these Zen ideals in the middle of the city. So Liz, next slide, please. And Michael last time described two very important people. We don't need to go through their biographies in total, but Shuko, Murata Shuko, again, not a clergyman, not an aristocratic person, but from a merchant class. And he was the one who moved away from these very formal, rare Chinese influenced teas to this idea of the mountain hut in the city. And then he is followed by perhaps the greatest tea master of all, Sen no Rikyu, also from the merchant class. And Rikyu was in the middle. He was both a tea advisor to the shogun, to Hideyoshi, practicing tea in that aristocratic tradition in gorgeous surroundings, but also Rikyu was very interested in following this path that Shuko blazed essentially down to this rustic, pared down kind of tea. And this is where we get this term wabi. Wa meaning informal or Japanese style, bi meaning beauty, wabi, informal beauty. So Rikyu is the person who unifies these two traditions, and both of them survive to this day, and both of them, as Lara will describe, can be seen in tea gardens. So let's move on, please, Liz, to the next slide. So we find here now tea gardens that are respective of these various traditions, and we'll look at them now. Sand and rock gardens with just a few plantings in temple and aristocratic settings. And importantly, these gardens are usually, you look at them, you don't necessarily go into them. Then we graduate to somewhat less formal gardens, maybe courtyard gardens with some evergreen plants, maybe some flowers, maybe a path, but not much other structure. And then we finally get to these evergreen gardens with a very Zen flavor and a specific path through them. And we're seeing as we go, smaller spaces, not big grand spaces, more compact spaces. And this is in keeping with this idea of these Wabi, these informal beauty tea houses. Next, please. So let's take a walk through some of these gardens. This is a very famous garden at Daisenyin in Kyoto. It dates from the 16th century. And as you can see, this board that's coming up on the lower left-hand side is an actual veranda of the building. And so you walk or you sit in meditation and you look at this garden, which is full of the raked sand, the symbolic rocks, and so on. And this is something that you absolutely see in the Zen temples and in other aristocratic settings, a very sort of formal, don't touch me, just look at me kind of style, full of literary allusion for those that were able to read this kind of symbolism. Moving on now. Now here's a kind of graduated garden. I mentioned that the merchants had their shops on the main street and they had their residences behind those shops. And then behind those, there would be this courtyard. Well, this is a little internal courtyard. There are no surviving tea gardens from that period. This dates to the 1860s. It was built after a fire in Kyoto. As many of you will know, Kyoto was frequently vulnerable to fires. But this references those 17th and 18th century traditions. You can still visit it. It's located between the back of a merchant shop and the front of the reception rooms, which could also be tea rooms. And here you see there are some plantings, but again, still mainly earth and rocks. You have importantly here a lantern, a stone lantern, and we'll talk about these in a few minutes. And that gives this kind of religious or temple aura, as well as providing light if you're giving the tea at night. And then that little carved out basin in the foreground is for cleansing your hands and your mouth prior to entering the tea house. So this is a kind of intermediate, if you will, tea garden. Shall we see the next one now, Liz? And now we go to a full Wabi style garden. This is a very famous garden at Omote Senkei. There are the three schools founded by descendants of Sen no Rikyu. They're called the Sen schools, the Senkei, and Omote Senkei is one of them. My school, Ura Senkei, is another. There's another around the corner from this one, Mushanokoji Senkei. And this was really dated from the mid-17th century. And then after fires and disruptions, it was rebuilt in the 18th and early 20th century. But it has this refinement. It's designed to be entered in. It's designed to be walked in. And it has all of this Zen symbolism. The idea that you're leaving the outside world behind and you're graduating to that of the tea house. So it's not just a path that you physically walk down, it's also a spiritual path. And so it has these metaphorical objects and functional objects both in them. So let's go to the next page. And now we're talking about going from what was a tea garden, something you looked at, to this idea of the Roji. And Roji are two characters that can be read in many, many ways. In English, we say tea garden. In Japanese, there are so many ways of writing the characters that are pronounced Roji. The literal term, tea garden, is chaniwa, but that's also used, but not as frequently. And in our case, Liz, if we go to the next slide, please. The original houses, as I mentioned, were in these courtyards behind the shops and the dwellings of the merchant class. So one of the ways of reading the characters Roji was an alleyway. In other words, there were, and on the old maps, you see sometimes alleyway leading back to the rear courtyard where there was this little rustic dwelling. And as the tea masters increasingly thought about Zen in this kind of refined poverty, this subtle beauty, this Wabi idea, they realized that you didn't have to simply sit and meditate. This was something that the temples had taught too. Maybe some of you have learned about this idea of moving meditation, so-called zazen, where everything that you did, maintaining, cleaning the garden, the entry from the garden, walking through the garden to the tea house, could become a form of moving Zen meditation. And so increasingly, instead of the Roji using the characters for alleyway, they increasingly use this idea, Michael referred to it, the dewy path, the path of dew. And this term refers to a scene in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddhist Lotus Sutra, which is a scene of enlightenment. But broadly speaking, we're talking about a place, this precious garden, in which the outside world is left behind, and where inside your inner purity and outer purity and simplicity are the things that reign and control. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through the elements that you find in the Roji, and then Lara is going to go and talk about some of the plants, and then we'll come back and talk about structures. So when you're walking through a Roji, the first thing you come to is the outer gate. This is where you have the world on the outside, and you go through that gate into the inside to this special world. It's not a fancy garden. There aren't a lot of flowers. It's typically characterized by evergreen plantings, some flowers. There are stories about tea masters and flowers. Michael mentioned one last time. When you walk through, you're walking on stepping stones. Sometimes they're set into the ground in a way that you have to pay attention and walk with care. Sometimes they're straight paving stones, but the stones themselves are objects of attention and connoisseurship. You also have bare earth, and Lara will go into this. There may be a mixture of bare earth, gravel, or moss. And as you go in, there's a place for the guests to now sit and wait, a bench or an arbor where you wait the sound of the gong from a distance that summons you to the tea house. On the way to the tea house, you're going to stop at a stone water basin, usually set low in the ground. There are some that are standing, made for aristocrats who weren't going to kneel, but usually they're set low in the ground with a bamboo ladle. The guests symbolically wash their hands and rinse their mouths, purify themselves before going into the tea garden. And then importantly, particularly at a time before modern lighting devices, you had sources of light in the form of portable lanterns, and I mentioned already stone lanterns. The next page, please, Liz. And if you're getting into larger or more complex Roji, you might have different kinds of stepping stones. You would not have only an outer gate, you would have a middle gate. This is another symbolic division between the outer Roji where you waited and the inner Roji, which is situated closer to the tea house. As I said, more stone lanterns, more formal gardens. And believe it or not, in the samurai period, because the samurai, unlike the merchants, could carry two swords, long and short swords, to defend themselves and to assert their status, they weren't allowed to bring those inside the tea house. This is where the famous so-called democracy of the classes inside the tea house asserts itself. And there was a rack outside where your guests would remove and deposit their swords in this peaceful gesture. And then also we'll talk about some ornamental sites that are relating to cleanliness and attention to the guests. Believe it or not, a place where you could show that you'd swept the garden, put some decorative garden debris in there, or a privy, that is to say a toilet, but it wasn't one that you could actually use. It was just to be looked at. It was supposed to be clean. There were other privies sometimes provided in a separate location. So let's move on here. And here's our outer gate. And here's two examples. You can see these are very simple. They're not big formal gates, usually made of bamboo. The one on the left you can see has this wonderful thatched roof to it, almost a Shinto feel to it in some ways. And then the one on the right is set into a wall. The wall could be the outside, and then the gate is leading you into that inner garden. It's a divider, as I said, between two worlds. And now that we're in the garden, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to hand things over to Lara for a few minutes, who's going to talk about those evergreen plantings that I've been referring to. So Lara?
Thank you, Bill. And now that Bill has taken us into the garden through that Sotomon, the outer gate, let's begin walking down the path. And the atmosphere was meant to be, as Bill has mentioned, a mountain path. You're in the woods, but not quite the wilderness. Instead, imagine the atmosphere of a rustic hut, as Bill mentioned, or a temple in the mountains. And we shouldn't underestimate that feeling of entering through the Sotomon into a cool green space. And I think a lot of you have probably had that experience in Kyoto or another Japanese city in June or another summer month, and you leave the hot street or courtyard and you enter into a cool tea garden, and it's a transformative experience. Speaking of the geography of Kyoto and other Japanese cities, Kyoto Prefecture was an area of basins and mountains, and so you truly could experience that change of climate if you were to climb up into the outskirts of the city and into the mountains, or simply into one of these courtyards. That also reminds us why we find stone paths and lanterns in these gardens. This wasn't exactly a wilderness such as you might find in New York State or somewhere else in the United States, but a more lived in woods than we might have here. And naturally then, in a Roji, shade plants are appropriate, just like one of these shady paths that I'm showing. Next slide, please. So we can talk about a hierarchy of plantings, such as we might find in the mountain woods. And the first level would be forest cover. So in a garden, these are evergreens, but they're pruned not to get too tall or too close. This is meant to be an intimate atmosphere, but those evergreens aren't meant to be a hedge. We do want some light coming through that filters down to the lower plantings. So here in this slide that I'm showing you, you can see, I think it's a false cypress at the back that goes up and above my picture, but it lets some light through. And other common plantings are pines and yew, which we also have here. And then below that, we have the understory shrubs. So partly these help evoke the forest, they're naturally occurring, but also they help enclose the path. So as you've entered, you walk a little bit, you can see perhaps a glimpse of the tea house. You walk a little more, you see another view, but these plantings help manage your view and your experience. And some favorite shrubs are Japanese holly, camellia, one of my favorites actually, and Andromeda, which we also have here. And then moving lower, there are low-growing plants such as you see here next to the stone. And what's important is those are grown in clumps. They are cultivated so that you see just the right cluster here next to the stone. What we don't tend to see is a whole carpet, for example, of these green plants. What this slide is showing really nicely, though, is sometimes pine needles are laid down, and those protect the moss in the winter. And you know, if this weren't a Japanese garden, you might imagine those needles had just fallen there, but no, these are very carefully laid down on the moss, and it's quite time consuming actually to mulch with pine needles in that way. Next slide, please. Now, as Bill mentioned, the Roji is not a garden that is exploding with color. But interestingly, some select flowering plants were appreciated, and these were enjoyed for seasonal color. For example, the camellia, I remember seeing it actually in South China blooming in February, and also I've seen it here blooming in the early spring, so late winter, early spring. Another plant that blooms about that time is the Japanese plum, or this Prunus mume that you see on the slide text. Also wild cherries. So as I've written here, partly these give a mountain aura, but more than that, they give the aura of a specific place, a specific mountains, and those are the mountains of Honshu, where many of these tea gardens were. So here, what I'm actually showing you on screen is a villa that the really wonderful writer on Japanese gardens, Mark Keene, mentioned in his book, The Japanese Tea Garden. It's the villa of the painter Hashimoto Kansetsu. And he says that cryptomeria, those are also called sugi, and grass bamboo, it specifically evoked the woods north of Kyoto. So emphasizing that native plants were used in Japanese gardens, also emphasizing that some of you might know these flowers have a really rich history in Chinese and Japanese literature and art. We frequently see the camellia, the mountain plum in paintings. So just one more indication that these tea gardens absolutely had a rustic aesthetic. At the same time, they were very sophisticated. We'll take the next slide. Moving now from Japan to the United States and some of our wonderful Japanese gardens. A little later, I'll speak more about them, but here to say, many of our gardens in North America use a mix of native and Japanese plants to achieve that woodsy atmosphere that we've been talking about. And not at all surprising that they use a mix of plants. If any of you are familiar with botany, we know that plants have been mixing and crossing continents for millennia. And so we actually share plants, native plants, between North America and Japan. But what I'm showing here are some of the understory plants that have been cultivated at the Seattle Japanese garden. And I have that Andromeda, or also called a Pyrus japonica, that I mentioned earlier. And then a huckleberry, native to the United States, and Oregon grape. And actually, as you look at this picture, it's quite a bit more flowery than we often see in a Roji in Japan, perhaps. But I think that's just the style of photography. We do emphasize blossoms here in the United States. But if I turn to the next slide, you'll see here is the atmosphere at the Seattle Japanese garden. And I'm showing you their tea house, the Shosei-an. And you can see what a wonderful place of greenery and a subtle mixture of maples, some lower shrubbery, and then also those clumps of ferns that I have been talking about. And so now we are going to go, I'll turn you back to Bill Jarvis for just another slide before I go on.
Well, thanks, Lara. If we could have the next slide, please, that would be great, Liz. Thank you. We mentioned stepping stones, and Lara emphasized this. There are different ways to walk through a tea garden. On the left-hand side, you see these irregular stones, and they're set about, call it 2 or 3 inches above the earth. So if you're walking along this path, you're walking often wearing traditional Japanese clogs, sort of outdoor shoes. This is not going to be the easiest path. You have to really think about where you're setting your feet. And these stones will be set so that there's probably only one correct way to walk the path. You have to put the left foot on one stone and the right foot on another and the left foot on the next one and so on. Importantly, that stone in the middle on the left, which has the big circle in the middle, is based on stones that were actually used in some of the tea gardens, where the circle, that was a foundation stone for a column, a big wooden column of a Buddhist temple. Many of you, for example, if you've been to the Todaiji in Nara, or to some of the great temples at Daitokuji, these are wooden structures and they are set on stone foundation stones. And so that stone circle would have been specifically there to accommodate the wooden pillar, the column of a temple. Now, obviously, the temple is no longer there, but that aura, that reminiscence of this being a sacred and a place that's been sanctified is there. Interestingly enough, as you can imagine, those native stones from old temples, there are only so many of them. And so as tea designers began to get into this concept, they would actually reproduce stones that looked like they had this temple aura, again, to give that notion of sanctity. Here on the right-hand side, we see a different way of doing it. You've still got raised stones, but it looks more like a traditional stone path. What we're showing here in the middle is what's called the tobe ishi, a stopping stone. And it has a very distinctive decoration to it. It's been tied with black cord in this cross shape, right angle shape. And this is to be found in a garden which might have 2 or 3 paths, or sometimes there would be temple gardens with multiple tea houses. So if you're showing up for a tea and you come down a path and you see this tobe ishi, it means, oops, you've gone the wrong way. Don't go down this path. Go and find the one that doesn't have the stopping stone on it. So these are just a couple of ways of thinking about how you're going to be ambulating through this spiritual experience, not walking straight ahead, but thinking carefully about what you're doing. So Lara, back to you.
We'll take the next slide. So thank you for introducing us to the paths. And I thought I would also show us one here in North America. And also to continue with my hierarchy of plantings, taking us right to the ground level. This image emphasizes that bare ground is acceptable in a tea garden. And I think that sometimes gets forgotten as we garden here in the United States. Also, many Japanese gardens are in a climate where moss naturally grows. And of course, we have those beautiful carpets of moss in Japan, and also here, especially in the Pacific Northwest. We can find that in Japanese gardens as well. It is hard work to maintain moss and also to maintain bare ground. But we can see that this garden at the University of Illinois, their tea house, their Japan House tea garden, they've chosen bare ground around the stones, as well as shrubbery, and then some selective ground covers. And they mentioned that one of the plants they use is wild Canadian ginger, which I picked up on because it also grows well here in New York. So that would be an option for a ground cover in our Hammond garden, or perhaps one of yours. And now I'll go back to Bill.
Thanks, Lara. Can we go to the next slide, please, Liz? So let's take a walk through the Roji, and we've described to you what these things are. Let's take a look at some pictures. We've already gone through the gate. We've been walking down this path, and now we come to the waiting arbor, the waiting bench. And this is where the guests would seat themselves, usually in a specific order, with the chief guest or shokyaku in one position, and the other guests and the final last guest. What you're seeing here on the left is a covered arbor, relatively formal. It's actually a little structure. I believe this actually has been reversed, because normally, of course, if you were going to be the chief guest would be on the right-hand side of the bench, not of our picture. And you can see there's been a treatment of the stones in front, where that chief guest actually has a little paving rectangle in front of their stone, in front of their seat, so that they sit separately. The little box that you're seeing, that bracketed box on the left-hand side, is a tabakobon, something that sort of symbolically shows relaxation. Normally, people don't actually smoke the little brass pipes and the twisted tobacco, but it's there traditionally as a sign to the guests that they can relax. On the right-hand side, you see a somewhat more rustic tea waiting arbor. This one, the bench is actually made of slats of bamboo. And so you can imagine the guests sitting there. Again, the chief guest on the right at that slightly differentiated place, and the others moving off to the left of them. And if we look at the next slide. So they've waited, and then mysteriously this sound comes to them. It's a little brass gong. It's struck in a certain number of ways, and they attend to it, and then the guests begin to move through the garden, and they follow the path that we've shown, and they come to the stone water basin. Now, I mentioned that there are some where you can stand, those were made for aristocrats, but for the most part, these water basins were meant to be crouched down and used in a crouching manner. And you can see there's a basin. They come in many, many different varieties. Some of them actually old Buddhist stupas or parts of old lanterns, some natural stones that have been hollowed out. But in every case, you have the ladle, which is a specially designed ladle, sitting with its mouth facing off to the left. And if you can notice, in both cases, at the foot of the basin, you have a place where there are some stones that have been, smaller stones that have been arranged. This is because when the guests come, they're going to crouch on the two stones on either side. They're going to pick up the ladle with their right hand. They're going to take a scoop of water and rinse their left hand, rinse their right hand, and then symbolically touch their mouth. And then they are going to upend the ladle with the handle pointing down so that the water runs down the handle to purify the ladle before putting it back. And all of that excess water is going to run into these smaller stones, which serve as a kind of drain, if you will. So this looks very natural, it looks very informal, but it's actually very precisely set for the kind of function that it's going to be used for. Now that they've cleaned themselves and purified themselves symbolically, next step, please, Liz. We might be in a situation where it's dark. Many, many, many teas in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries were held very early in the morning. People would get up at 4 or 5 in the morning. They would greet each other in the tea garden. And bear in mind that the tea ceremony that many people see, where it lasts about 20 minutes and you serve a bowl of tea, that's not a real tea. That's not a real chaji, as it's called. The actual chaji refers to a formal meal and the service of thick tea and the service of thin tea and a little time to stretch in between. And so by the time that tea is accomplished, 3 or 4 hours have passed. And so you had this situation where it was very, very common to begin in the dark in the very early morning and to end just after sunrise. Why? Because as we heard earlier, it gets quite hot in Kyoto in the summertime. And so here are some beautiful portable lanterns. The one on the upper left is actually a handheld lantern. The guests and the hosts exchange these as they greet each other on the path. The others are more conventional ones that can be carried, but might also be put on the side, perhaps by that stone rinsing basin so that you could have a chance to see what you were doing in the dark, or they might be carried by the guests in order to light their way along that path, which, as we saw, can sometimes be a little bit difficult and close. Next slide, please. And the stepping stones themselves, as I said, might be varied. Here are examples of what are called tatami ishi. They're like tatami mats, but they're not all the same. The one on the left mixes straight and smooth stones. You can see in the middle distance on the right, there's a straight stone. And then on the left, we see several patterns of mixed small stones, mixed straight and small stones, and others. So there's a predominance of variation, if you will, in the stepping stone path. Next slide, please. I mentioned also that in larger gardens, you might not just have an outer gate, which would let you into the entire garden, but you might have this middle gate, which sits between the place where the waiting arbor is and on the inside, the place where you would purify yourself. So this is often not much of a structure. It could just be a piece of wall standing in the middle of the garden. The one on the left is just that. It's a piece of wall. It's not a building. And as you can see, it has a kind of halfway open gate that you have to step significantly over that threshold in order to get into that place where there's the tea house. So there's a definite sense of threshold there. On the right-hand side, we see a gate that's barely a gate at all. It's just a woven bamboo wicket with the hinge is on the top of the gate. It's being propped up by the stick that you see in the background. And again, this is purely symbolic. And this is intended to focus the guests on the fact that they are not in the outside world anymore. They are in this other world, this world of purity, and they are going to come close and soon enter the tea room, which is a room in which that harmony and purity are going to reign. Next slide, please. I mentioned temple lanterns. They're hidden in plain view. Here on the left, we see just a fantastic setting of stones, the middle gate, and then off to the right, sort of nestled in the bushes, that temple lantern. And you can imagine if you were coming to this in the nighttime, perhaps with your handheld lantern or candle to see your way. And there in the distance is that temple lantern with its little candle and lamp in it, giving you that warmth and saying, here, come to me. This is the way to get to the middle gate. On the right-hand side, you see what I mentioned earlier, the function of the lantern as an illuminating device for the basin where you would rinse your hands and your mouth. Next slide, please. I mentioned sword racks. I couldn't let it go. These actually did exist. This double bracket that you see going across the top, we're just outside the doors of the tea house now. We're getting very, very close. And at the bottom, you can see a stone. And the idea of the stone is you or your attendant, your servant, would step up onto the stone and place the swords there so that you didn't bring them into the tea room. You had that sense of peace in the tea room. And now just a couple more features in the next slide that I mentioned. The decorative garden debris pit. Here it is. It's a little square basin. The host has put some symbolic leaves and garden trash in there, and you can inspect that. And that's his signal to you that the host has actually done the work of cleaning the garden. maybe not totally clean. Maybe, as Lara said, there might be some pine needles left down there to indicate fall. Maybe there might be a leaf or two to indicate that things were not too scrubbed clean, but that the host had done this kind of scrupulous cleaning for you. And on the right-hand side, not to dwell, but here's the privy, all set up for comfort in a symbolic way. And even up on the stone in front, a kettle with some warm water for washing. So now I'm going to, on the next slide, talk about this using the Roji, and then I'm going to hand it back to Lara. So all these things are intentional, right? The outer gate is left slightly ajar by the hosts. Your guests assemble outside, again, usually in their order, first guest and then the other guest, and the last guest comes in behind, and the last guest will close the gate behind them. Often the gate is set so you can close it with a click or an audible noise, and that's a signal to the host that the guests are there. They seat themselves in the waiting area, and then the host comes out, doesn't shake hands, doesn't say, how you doing? He just bows to them, and then he withdraws, finalizing his preparations. You hear the host signal, this faint gong coming as over a mountain pass. The guests go to the water basin, they purify themselves, they continue up that stone pathway. There may be a middle gate or not, but they come to the tea house and they enter. So this is how the Roji gets used. And next slide. There are other uses for the Roji. I mentioned if you've got a meal and thick tea and thin tea, there are these places where the guests will leave the tea house, go back into the Roji, and they may even go to the waiting bench to relax or refresh themselves and go into the tea room for the next phase. And then when the tea is ended, they reverse their path and exit through the outer gate. So now I'm going to ask Lara to go into more detail, I think in our next slide, on elements in the tea garden. So please go ahead, Lara.
Thank you. So we've had this wonderful list and explanation of the elements that make a Roji a Roji. I'm going to bring you into a little bit of garden history because that will take us up step by step to the Hammond garden. So what's really interesting is that as tea service and its garden setting, the Roji came to indicate good taste in this long stretch of time, the 16th through the 21st century. The elements we just heard about were incorporated into many kinds of gardens, and these included the estates of the Daimyo, imperial gardens, wealthy merchant courtyard gardens, but these being bigger than these small courtyards we've just been talking about. They really were estates by the time we get to the Meiji era. And even ryokan and today hotels in Kyoto. So what I'm showing you here on the left is a lantern, but a sculptural lantern that's quite different from the temple style lanterns that were pioneered in the Roji. And this one is in the Kenroku-en in Kanazawa. I hope some of you have had a chance to go there. Next slide. Now, more than just these individual elements from the Roji taking their place in various gardens, I've given you this quotation again from Mark Keene, and what he tells us here is that it can be argued that the Stroll gardens had a similar task on a grander scale. That the paths through the woods and along the great ponds, the various bridges and gates, and the subdued plantings of mostly evergreen trees were intended as an elaborate, extended Roji. So what he's saying here is that although the daimyo, the lords, built expansive gardens with big water features and views, like a Roji, they were meant to let us enter into a garden and escape from our day-to-day. And within that daimyo stroll garden, some visitors had a bowl of tea. So there's that comparison with the Roji as well. Next slide. And I thought I would give you a little more detail. For example, a daimyo stroll garden might have a tea house. Some of them were quite different from what we've been talking about. They were meant to view this great landscape that you had been invited into, but some of them were more intimate, like the tea houses in the Wabi atmosphere that we have just been talking about. And this example I'm showing you, this is Shunsoro, and it was built in part by Oda Uraku. And he was a tea master, but also a very high-ranking samurai. Many centuries later, it was moved to the garden of the Yokohama merchant Hara Sankei, and now it's part of the Sankei Inn there in Yokohama. And actually, this is quite an extensive structure by now. It was added to over the years, so perhaps it's just the smaller front part that was built in the 1600s. So within these Daimyo Stroll gardens, we can also have an escape within an escape, an intimate tea house within a stroll garden. Next slide. As I mentioned, gardens with Roji elements could be found at the Ryokan in the Edo period. They can be found in contemporary hotels in Kyoto. And here I'm showing you the Kyoto Heian Hotel, and bringing us very close to Bill's recent slide, we see that lantern there on the right, just peeking out from the foliage. Next slide. And just as Japanese gardens of the Edo and modern periods took up elements of the Roji, so did Japanese style gardens in North America. And that's not at all surprising, because travelers in the 19th century and the 20th century, when they went to Japan, they visited a variety of gardens, ranging from tea gardens to stroll gardens. And they brought home with them what they thought should be in a Japanese garden. For example, lanterns and stepping stone paths. So what I'm showing you here is, on the left, one of the earliest Japanese style gardens in North America. It is now sited in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. You can see, of course, the lantern, and you can see the tea pavilion, where tea was served since 1894. And then on the right, you see the stepping stone path of Shofuso, and that is now in Philadelphia, but it was originally a Japanese house with a small garden that was built for a MoMA exhibition in the 1950s. And that house in the garden exhibition, it played a really big role in popularizing the Japanese aesthetic around the United States. And so from seeing that house with its small garden, many more were built in the mid-century. Next slide. So this is a beautiful picture of a garden path. So it's up on the screen partly for that reason, but also to show you a later Japanese style garden that was built at the Montreal Botanical Garden, first in 1988 and then updated early in the 21st century. And the designer of this garden emphasized that he built gardens that had the spirit of a Japanese garden, but didn't necessarily use Japanese plants. And so what you see here in Montreal, this designer, Ken Nakajima, he has used hostas, ferns. I believe we have some pine also in the background. And these are also plants that grow well, not too far away in New York. Now, with that short history of garden evolution, we can move to the Hammond Garden. So next slide. When Natalie Hammond built her garden in 1961, so she was part of that trend of garden building in the mid-20th century, she imagined that the garden would offer an escape from urban and suburban New York. It would encourage tranquility and provide a world apart as well as a world within. And so there we have it, a sentiment very much like the atmosphere of a Roji in Japan. Next slide. So now we can list some of the Roji elements that we find right at the Hammond. This is our outer gate, And actually, we've had some recent changes, and you no longer see this cedar fence that was becoming a little bit dilapidated. So it's been a bit renewed. Now, of course, simply finding Roji elements at the Hammond, it doesn't make this a tea garden, but instead one of these gardens that shared many elements of the Roji, like so many gardens in Japan and the United States. Stepping through this gate from Natalie Hammond's courtyard, which was quite a formal European courtyard, once you step through this gate, indeed you entered a different world, a different spiritual atmosphere, and a different natural atmosphere. Next slide. Lanterns, of course, we're seeing more of them. Natalie Hammond was an art collector, and we can think of the lanterns in her garden as part of her art collection. They're quite varied. They're placed in different parts of the garden. Here you're seeing one near the top of the pond, and here near the south end of the garden, quite hidden from view when you first enter. Next slide. And there are also areas of our garden which evoke that atmosphere of walking through the woods, and not the untouched wilderness, but an area that has been partly shaped by human hands. These are stones that Natalie Hammond stood up to symbolize the 16 followers of the Buddha. She called them her garden of Ryokan or Lohan, if you're more familiar with the Chinese. Next slide. Now, certainly you can tell as we look at these pictures of the Hammond, we are not looking at the kind of precisely cultivated, precisely designed atmosphere that Bill just described. And here we're seeing that water ladle laid so carefully over the basin. And yet, as our garden develops, that is the kind of care that we can do more of. For example, this is the small waterfall that Natalie Hammond constructed, and you can see really quite a charming water basin at the end of it. So if we were to do some of the maintenance work that's done every day at a Roji, we would want to select clumps of this ground cover so that we don't see a mass, but instead a chosen selection. We would want to choose and prune these lower level shrubs so they surround us in just the right way. And once we do that, then we might see this water basin standing out and calling to us with just the right volume, as it does in a Japanese garden. And next slide. The Japanese stroll garden at the Hammond was not designed as a tea garden, although it has these many elements of Roji. But nonetheless, there are many ways that visitors did experience it in ways comparable to visitors to a Roji. And there's many ways you can still experience that as you visit. As you step through that outer gate, you walk on the stepping stones that are placed within that gate. And then once inside, you experience evergreens, lower growing trees, and some beautiful clumps of primroses, for example, iris, ferns, and the many other plants we have in the garden. As we look forward to the Hammond's future, we would love to have an outdoor tea house. We currently have a beautiful indoor tea room, but we look forward to having a tea house at the south end of our garden. And when we do that, we would certainly want to build a proper Roji garden around it so that we can have the full atmosphere. But until then, enjoy your visits to the Hammond. And now I would just like to briefly turn it to Michael McKenna, who will introduce what's to come in this tea series.
Thank you very much, Laura and Bill, for a very, very dense, in the best sense of the word, dense in terms of the richness of what you're showing us. It was fascinating. But briefly, in case any of you need to leave us before the question and answer period, I'd like to point out that our next program will be on the 27th of July, the fourth Tuesday of the month at 7 o'clock again. The next element of tea that we will look at is the kakejiku, the scroll that is the first thing that one sees when one looks through the door to the tea room, to the tea house. The scroll that gives a hint to the intentions, to the theme that the host is trying to create in his tea. Yasuko Hara Sensei will be our first speaker there to talk about the scroll, and her husband, Zensho Martin Hara, will talk about the Zen elements that had much to do with shaping the tea ceremony since the 16th century. So thanks again to our speakers today. I think it's time to open up for questions, and Liz, I think, will recognize people who would like to chip in.
Sure, thank you. Thank you to all of you. Does anybody participating have any questions they'd like to pose? Well, maybe while you're thinking, Susie Wynn, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, hi. I was just wondering the purpose of the island. Is that something I can ask here? I know Hammond Museum is not yet designed to have the traditional tea garden, but I was wondering if you can mention something about the island and any representation of the meaning of that in the tea garden. Is there any connection?
Well, the island is a feature of the garden that right away makes us think that this is a stroll garden, that this is a garden for visitors to stroll around the pond and then onto the island and enjoy that journey. Natalie Hammond, in some early reports, called it her island of the Bodhisattva, and I believe she had a Bodhisattva sculpture or perhaps a naturalistic stone that symbolized a Bodhisattva. So that's a really beloved feature of our garden, but I wouldn't say that's an area that has a particular connection with a tea garden. I would say there's a very nice stepping stone path which leads to the island, and you certainly have to choose your steps carefully as you go on. So perhaps there's that connection.
If I could elaborate just a little bit on that. There is in stroll gardens in Japan and also some in the United States, as you mentioned, Lara, this tradition of the island. One way of interpreting that island metaphorically is to characterize it as the island of the Taoist immortals. This place that was another place. In many gardens, you look at the island, there isn't even a bridge to the island, but you're not allowed to go on the island. The island is a place which is, again, something that you contemplate. And a very good example of that, we haven't seen a picture of it tonight, but for those in the New York metro area, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden has a wonderful small Japanese garden that was laid out in the early 20th century by a Japanese architect. And it does have a little island of the immortals with a bridge that you cannot go on.
Okay, I really, that's good to know. Be interesting because I really thought like maybe that's another escape within the escape world, but now I understand that something has a different meaning to it. And my second question is, it did not mention, I'm curious about the sound of the water in the traditional tea garden. Is there any symbolism or meaning? I understand there's the water basin to wash off before you enter to the tea house, but not mentioning the sound of the water. Is there any significance of that in this? I don't know if it makes sense.
Well,
my question.
I'm sure Lara has something to add to this, but we've mentioned several times this authority on the Japanese tea garden, Mark Keene, and Lara very professionally gave citations to her photos from his book. I very unprofessionally did not, but all of the photos that I used come from his book, The Japanese Tea Garden, which is still in print, can be ordered, and is really encyclopedic in its coverage of this. But Susie, to your question, there might be a natural waterfall in a tea garden that provides a little trickle, but there's typically not a spectacular big splashy waterfall. And in his book, Mark Keene even criticizes slightly the idea of the bamboo pipe feeding water into the rinsing basin as something that you would see in a ryokan or a hotel, but not in a real tea person's garden. So what's interesting to me here, Susie, is this idea that when you're in the garden, it's not completely silent. There will be perhaps muffled the noises of the city somewhere out there. There might be birds that would be in the garden, but you're really trying to turn inward and not necessarily be distracted by things. In other words, the things that are there are things to aid you in that contemplative thing that you're doing that takes you into the tea house, that takes you into the communion with the people who are there and with the host. So maybe that's a more complicated answer than the one you were seeking. Lara, what do you have to contribute to that?
Well, generally speaking about the tea garden, I think you covered that nicely. About the Hammond garden, visitors mention that when you step in through our outer gate, you hear the sound of that small waterfall. And it is not a big splashy sound, it's very modest, but that helps turn your attention to being in this natural site. And so it's an important element, and I'm glad you asked about that, Susie.
Thank you so much, because I do notice that as I enter through the gate at Hammond, and it's kind of helping the visitor to tune in and focus. And I was just wondering throughout the presentation that other than the host is when he's ready to do the gong sound, besides that, is there any significance of the water basin sound? But thanks for explaining it. I'm very fascinated, and it's a beautiful presentation. Thank you.
Actually, Susie, now that you mention it, there is one splashy thing that happens that we neglected to mention. And that is that while the guests are waiting in the arbor, the host has gone away, remember, he bowed and withdrew. One of the ways before the gong that the guests who are listening silently will hear is the host comes to that water basin, which is not being filled by a pipe. Remember now, it's just there. He comes with water and he splashes that water into the basin so that it's overflowing. And that is a tea garden sound for sure. And the guests listen to that, then the host goes away, finishes their final preparation, and then rings that gong. So thank you for bringing that up. It's something I'd forgotten, but when you're in a real tea, it's a little punctuation mark that says, oh man, now we're getting close.
Does anybody else have any questions? Ed, maybe just unmute yourself, please, and thank you.
I'd like to congratulate and thank both of our speakers for an almost unbelievable summary of principles and beauty and bringing it to reality and to the Hammond. So thank you so much. But their description reminded me actually of my tea teacher's garden in Japan, where I studied for several years. and she built her house, and she had another lot. But when she sold the other lot, she kept a little alley, if you will, so that you could enter, that you would have to enter the tea garden through, if what we would consider the back of the house. But it was this very, very narrow alley, and in it were the stones. Everything was the stones, and that's all you could do in that small alley, was walk on those stones. And she, as Bill said, she had artfully, because it was landscape, she had artfully placed evergreens and bamboos here and there. And then you had to turn the corner to be surprised and see the entry to the tea room, and then again the entry to a garden that could be viewed from the tea room where the basin was. But when she expanded on the garden, she built not only a gate, she had a front gate to the entry of the path, but she built a structure that served two purposes. One again, it separated the tea house and the tea garden from the street, but it was also a place where the guests could put their coats and their shoes. And it was, of course, artfully constructed and decorated. So I think that the principles, which have been shown to us in very classic contexts, are adapted and are used and are available for all of us with a little imagination. So thank you again for this wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you to Ed. If I can perhaps just ask a quick question of Lara, knowing that a lot of the plants in East Asia are rich with symbolic meaning, are any of the plantings included in a tea garden specifically selected for symbolic meaning? And then from a contrary point of view, aside from the not wanting anything overly colorful or overly showy, are there any plants that for whatever reason, symbolic or whatever, considered somewhat taboo for whatever reason?
I think you've asked me a question that I need to learn more about. And the reason for that is I've really approached this topic from Natalie Hammond's garden. And what your question brings up is that Natalie Hammond felt quite free to, as an artist, to design with, to play with the Japanese tradition. And so what I've ended up reading more about is, for example, you can just see in Liz's screen our azalea garden behind the island. And there Natalie Hammond planted, at that time, 5. Thank you, we're seeing it well.
Yes, right around. There's some, they're all over the place.
Yeah. At that time, near that lantern there, she planted 5 azaleas, and she said, well, these 5 azaleas, sea of white sand, they represent 5 attributes of the Buddha. She chose quite, she picked and chose from traditions. She also had her red garden over white sand. But when it comes to specific plantings in Japanese gardens, I've got more work to do. And I wonder if Bill has some thoughts on that question.
It's a dangerous question, Liz. The answer is, of course. And I'm not the garden historian. However, there are some really amazing examples in English. I'm thinking particularly of the book Chado by Sasaki Sarmi, which is, he was a 20th century tea master who kept a kind of reference diary going month by month throughout the year. And in the diary, he refers to everything you can do in a tea that month, from scrolls to themes to utensils, and of course to favored plants. And the plants in Japanese, you're talking about plants with homonyms that refer to other things. You're talking about plants that are featured in poetry or in famous scenery. And that goes, Lara, to your point about stroll gardens. You know, some of these imperial stroll gardens recreate poetic visions of seashores, of famous locations in China that people had read about or seen in screens. And so there's really kind of no end to it, Liz. And I would imagine that if you wanted to, you could write a very productive book about the use of plantings, both in classical Japanese tea gardens and of course in these more well-resourced stroll gardens that came up in the 18th and 19th centuries, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So that's maybe a way to approach the question.
Okay, thank you.
Not just limited to the gardens, but they're in the tea tradition of all the schools, I believe. There are inauspicious flowers that are not encouraged to be used as a tea flower, or even more broadly in ikebana, because they're either inauspicious for the reasons that Bill just talked about. They're too colorful, so that they're going to draw too much attention to themselves rather than to the whole environment, or they smell bad.
I was actually thinking stinky would be
Stinky would
would be a bad thing. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I think does that conclude us for this evening, for this very, really rich and informative program. Well, thank you so much. The recording will be available, and thank you once again to everybody.
And when the recording becomes available, it'll be available on YouTube with Hammond, the elements of tea, as your search phrases. The first episode is already available. This should be in a week or so.
Oh yeah, we just yes. So you can find it either by going to YouTube and searching as Michael just indicated, or we'll get a link on the Hammond website. So two ways to find it.
Great.
But thank you, and good night to all.